So in the last couple of videos, uh, Raman Maharshi was talking about the inquiry of who am I and the importance of it in terms of quieting the mind down. So Sivaprakasam Pillai now asks, are there other practices which are helpful to quiet the mind down other than this self-inquiry? And then Raman Maharshi says, yes, there are more practices which will quiet the mind down, but none of them are adequate enough. Yeah. And then he says, he gives the example. For example, the practice of pranayama or practice of the breath control. When you are following the practice of breath control and pranayama, uh, it is possible to quiet the mind down. And it is possible because the mind and the breath are the same. Right? The breath is the sort of grosser form of the mind, and mind is the subtler form. In fact, he says the breath and the mind originates from the same source or the originates from the same point, right? So they are exactly same. So if you control the breath, the mind will be controlled. If you control the mind, the breath will be quiet, right? It's how they are interlinked with each other. So he says, yes, of course, it is possible to quiet the mind down with controlling the breath, but it will only be quiet as long as your breath is under control, right? You didn't change the nature of the mind. You didn't uh, change the habit of the mind. Mind is still wandering, but as long as you have control over the breath, the mind will appear to be quiet. So this can be helpful as a preliminary practice, but it will not destroy the mind or it will not transcend the mind. Uh, but it can quiet the mind as long as you have control over the breath. Then he says there are other practices. For example, the practice on the uh, meditating in the form of the God, meditation on the form of the God, or mantras. These practices are there, and he says again the nature of the mind is wandering, right? So in these practices, what you are doing is you are giving only one object to the mind, and the mind is wandering in that object only, right? In that way, what happens is when the mind has thousands of thoughts, right? When the mind is uh, occupied with all these different kinds of thoughts, that mind is very weak. On the other hand, when the mind, all these thoughts get resolved and the mind is on the only one point or single pointed, that mind is very strong. So these practices kind of lead you to this single pointed focus. The mind is still doing, the nature of the mind is still there, the nature of pondering is still there. Once you get out of your meditation object, you will be doing the same thing, the mind will be doing the same thing, right? But he's saying these practices leads to this single pointed focus, right? And this single pointed focus makes the mind extremely strong, and that strength is very useful in the self inquiry, right? So if you have a single pointed mind, the mind which doesn't have so many thoughts, the mind which is more resolved, uh, that mind is very useful in the self inquiry. Okay. And then he puts a very interesting advice. He says among all these different practices, the best practice is to eat the sattvic food in the moderate quantity, because following that practice your mind will cultivate the sattvic qualities, and that mind is extremely useful for the self inquiry, right? That mind is a perfect aid for the self inquiry. What interesting advice, right? You will expect something like Raman Maharshi will tell you some kind of because he is a master of Vedanta and all that, so you will expect some kind of a strong practice of doing this or that. But the practice he is subscribing, the practice he is prescribing is to eat the sattvic food in the moderate quantity, and that will develop the sattvic qualities of the mind, and that will be very useful for you. Yeah, to quiet the mind down as well, right? And this relationship between food and your state of mind is very well understood in the Indian scriptures, right? Almost all the scriptures mention it. Bhagavad Gita also puts it. The what are the qualities of the sattvic food and why one, and what kind of effect it will have on the mind and all these kind of things, right? Vipassana meditation, they also puts this very clearly. The kind of food you eat will definitely decide the quality of your mind, right? And then if you eat some kind of heavy food, your mind will become lethargic. If you eat more spicy, that sort of food, your mind will become more agitated and all that kind of stuff. So it has a direct effect. Your food has a direct effect on the mind, right? And here the Raman Maharshi also mentioned the same thing. In fact, he says this is one of the best practice that you can follow. Other, instead of following pranayama and all these different practices to control the mind, the best thing you can do is just to eat the sattvic food in the moderate quantity, right? And that will naturally make the mind more quiet or sattvic. Okay. So what is the sattvic food? So Bhagavad Gita defines some qualities. It gives some qualities, what considered as a sattvic food, right? These are the properties of the sattvic food. And he says the one thing is sattvic food has a liveliness, right? It doesn't mean it is a non-veg. It has a life in it, right? Like a fresh fruit, it still has a life. It hasn't been rotten, right? Or the fresh vegetables or things like these, they have a life. Another one of the best example for the sattvic food is this sprouts, right? They are full of life, right? And that liveliness is one of the important aspect of the sattvic food, that it has to have a life. It cannot be rotten. For example, they also mention that you shouldn't eat food after cooking after three hours, or you should freeze it and reheat it and eat it that way, right? You shouldn't do that. Or you shouldn't cook the food to the point, like deep fry and all that, where it doesn't have any more life in it, right? You killed all the possibilities of the life in the food, right? So in that way he's saying, in that way, at least Bhagavad Gita mentions, the key quality of the sattvic food is it's lively, right? It's lively, it's fresh, probably even raw, and it has a sweetness. The naturally, ripened fruit, they have the sweetness, or the vegetables, in fact, they have the sweetness. So that's the like a very general categories of the sattvic food. In fact, there are a lot of YouTube channels which are uh, going in a great detail, giving the recipes, what can be the sattvic food, what are the qualities, and what are the different recipe, how to make it even more tasty and all that. So we can look into that. But the advice is quite amazing, right? Among all that things, the best thing you can do to quiet your mind down is to eat the sattvic food in the moderate quantity. Great.